Let's Talk with Anna Glavinsky.
We're talking now about a Jewish athlete in a deeply prejudiced society who didn't just succeed. He challenged stereotypes, built a public persona, and he even caught the attention of royalty, and his story is told in The Fighting Jew. I'm joined now by the author, Wynn Wheldon. Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Lovely to have you here. Now, for people who've never heard of Daniel Mendoza, how big a deal was he in his time?
He was a superstar. He was maybe the first a great sporting superstar. Celebrity was a new idea. He was undoubtedly a celebrity. There was a good deal of merch surrounded his fights, his successes. He was big in many ways.
Because we're talking about the 1700s here. How is a celebrity celebrated? How is that fandom or fame actually manifested in that era?
Well, I suppose simply, we know about the numbers of people who turned up to these fights, and we know that mugs were made and badges were made, and as I say, it was a great deal of merch. And as we also know, there was a great boom in newspapers. I think that in about 1780, around about 1780s, there was something like 23 newspapers in London alone, and 9 of those were daily papers. And as the golden age of boxing took off, these fights were reported in all the newspapers, and then these reports were copied throughout the country, and so these characters, these boxers, became big stars, and none were bigger than Daniel Mendoza.
And what was his impact on the sport? Because you actually say that he's the first scientific boxer.
Well, okay. So I tend to say that what he invented was getting out of the way. Prior to Daniel's appearance, boxers simply slugged at each other until one of them could bear no more slugging. He invented ducking, diving. He also was the first boxer really to fight with his elbows in. He was quite a small man, and so he had to get inside his enemies, his opponents. And in order to do that, he needed to thin himself, as it were. And once he was in, he punched very straight. Other boxers, they were haymakers like this. This is how they boxed. He boxed like that.
Okay, so we're just getting on the screen here. We're getting a side punch, coming in, a big swing coming in from the side versus little jabs coming straight in from in front of you.
Exactly, and he was well known for his lightning fists. So he was very, very quick at counter-punching. And so these techniques were obviously brand new. He was recognized as a great teacher. He had a school. He signed himself often, perhaps facetiously, as Daniel Mendoza, PP, Professor of Pugilism. So he introduced into boxing these kinds of technique which had not been seen before.
I actually find that, so I don't follow boxing, and I just find that mental because it just seems, for a start, it just seems so instinctive that you would bring your fists up to cover your face. You would duck away if somebody tries to punch you. I would have thought that was obvious. Maybe it goes to show a bit of the mentality of people living before that.
Well, I agree. I mean, it always seems to me I hesitate to swear, but very, very obvious that getting out of the way of a punch would be a good idea. But he really did. People did remark on the science and the technique that he adopted. And perhaps before that, there was some idea of that masculinity required you to be hit without flinching in some kind of strange way. I don't think Daniel took to that at all.
Well, I was going to say, I think people were made a little bit different back in the day, weren't they? People definitely took manliness and strength to a whole new level that I think in today's world, for better or worse, in today's world, we don't really subscribe to as much. But obviously we don't have video recordings of his fights. So how do you analyse his technique? How do you get all this information?
Well, there were, as I said before, there were reports in newspapers. People began to understand and know, understand boxing, as it were, understand pugilism. It was studied as an art and a science. Foremost among those journalists was a guy called Pierce Egan. Pierce Egan was really the first great sports reporter. He would have he would have been interested in your cycling exploits, that kind of stuff. And so he had a kind of forensic view of boxing, and but also with a literary flourish. And it was through him and through others that people came to understand and know how fighters fought. One of the, in his later career, Daniel, he put on shows at theatres throughout the country. In fact, in the end, he was much more of a performer than a boxer. And one of the things he did in these shows was to mimic other boxers' techniques, and this was always the biggest, most popular part of the show. So it was clear that audiences already knew. They became very quickly knowledgeable about boxing, and it was a huge thing. It was very fashionable from about 1785 onwards, and this was probably due to the patronage of the Prince of Wales, George, Prince of Wales, who took to it in a big way.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because what you're building a picture of is somebody who's not just a great technical boxer, it's someone who's cultivating that celebrity. You know, you're saying that he was a big name. Sounds like he knew how to work that personal brand and get in with the right people. Tell that part of the story.
Well, I think that's true. I think he was himself an engaging and conversational character. So I think he was popular with people. But the fact is that boxing in that age really became big by its association with horse racing. And horse racing was big because of gambling. And gambling was big because aristocrats, principally Whig aristocrats, spent vast amounts of money on horses and on gambling and on boxing. And so willy-nilly, Dan Mendoza came into contact with all sorts of people, including the Prince of Wales. And so he also recognized that in order to publicize himself, it was important to be in the newspapers. This was another way of promoting himself. He had this famous series of fights with a chap called Richard Humphreys, which also involved a great to-do, a back and forth of letters in the newspapers, which became in itself of interest and entertainment. So there were all sorts of ways in which Dan approached the business of publicising himself and of publicising the sport.
And he's also, whether it would have been the elephant in the room at the time, but he's a Jewish athlete. So what did that mean in society at that time?
Well, this was very important, and I start the book with a story about a robbery that went wrong in Chelsea in 1780 something or other. I can't quite remember. In which two people were killed, and the perpetrators were Jews from Amsterdam. Actually, I don't know. They were Dutch Jews, but it caused a great outrage among the public in London and in England, and anti-Semitism for a while became very, very vicious. And it was down to Dan and fighters who came after him, who he trained, to raise the status of the Jew in London and in the UK. It was very important. Jews and Catholics and dissenters were all regarded as rather suspicious types, both by politicians and by the public at large. And what Dan did for the Jews was to make them, in some sense, respectable and feared in some way. You didn't prior to Dan's appearance on the national stage, Jews were quite often attacked and spat at and shouted at. And it happened a good deal less after Mendoza appeared.
Wow, anyway. That's a huge impact. But how relevant is his story today? Whether we're looking at it from the anti-Semitism point of view, his techniques in boxing, how much of that's still used, or just generally that cultivation of your own personal brand. I mean, that's a pretty big thing these days as well.
Well, it is. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. There are great questions about masculinity, about nationalism, about anti-Semitism. All these great subjects were very much to the fore at the end of the 18th century, and Mendoza had much to do with all of those. But he was emphatically a Londoner, but emphatically also Jewish. He was proud of being a Londoner, and he was proud of being Jewish. He could speak Hebrew, and he was literate. His grandfather had written books, so he wasn't. I don't know whether we'd mentioned that There were three things that he was really important for. Clearly, he was important as a hero of the Jews. He was important as a scientific boxer, but he was also important because he wrote the first sporting autobiography, his own life, and in those three respects, those are what make him important. Sorry, I've lost my thread now. I can't remember what you asked me.
That's really interesting. I was just asking about his relevance in today's world.
Yes.
How his story gets brought into the 21st century.
Well, I think that's right. So I think we see. I think from the boxing point of view, it's neither here nor there. So people now use gloves and all the rest of it. So his techniques, which were very basic at the time, remain. I mean, we know that you defend your face and you keep low and
keep your hands up, keep low. Yeah,
exactly. So there's no great change there. Anti-Semitism, as we know, is now rising in the West. It's a horrible thing, but there we are. So it's important to keep him in mind. In a recent list, he was rated the 82nd most influential Jew of all time. I think Arthur Miller was ahead of him, and Stephen Sondheim was below him. So he was sandwiched by great theatrical genius. I'm sure he would have approved of that. But anyway, so he continued to be important, and I think he's grown in importance, actually, because as people become more obsessed with identity and so on and so forth, he becomes more interesting to historians in terms of masculinity. And as I was saying, the haymaking, brawling boxers who preceded him, that was one kind of masculinity, and it may be that his desire to keep out of the way of punches was a new kind of masculinity at work. I don't know. I'm no expert on these matters. So
wow, so almost a societal shift in the way that masculinity is viewed, perhaps. That is a big statement. So just wrapping things up now with the actual book. What's it like? Who's it for? Any extra messages that you hope people will get from it?
Well, I wrote it because my wife is descended from Daniel's uncle. And so I was always interested in the subject. It's a book. It's not a book for the specialist. It's not an academic book. Mm-hmm. It's not really a sporting book. It's a book about... it also had to be written because there had been no full-length biography of Daniel Mendoza, which was a shameful situation. So it's for anybody who's interested in... the life of a late 18th century superstar.
Interesting people and interesting lives, it sounds like, in a nutshell. It's been written by Wynn Wheldon, who we've just been speaking to. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It has been a pleasure. And the book is called The Fighting Jew. You can find it on Amazon or the Talk Radio Europe bookshop. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.